This afternoon, I am in Washington, D.C. at the Georgetown University Law Library, visiting with Marylin J Raisch, who is the Associate Director for Research and Collection Development here at the Law Library. Marylin, it is our custom to begin these conversations finding out a little about you and your counterparts as real people, not just librarians. And so in that context, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your life, perhaps not only today, but even when you were younger?
Well, thank you, Pat. I'd be glad to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana. That's my hometown.
A fun place for conventions.
Yes. So it's timely for this interview that I bring up my hometown and some of the influences that it had on me growing up. My parents, actually, both of them were from Oklahoma and moved to New Orleans when my father set up his medical practice. He was a psychiatrist and neurologist, and he set up a private practice with psychoanalysts. So at this time, in the mid to late 1940s and early 1950s, psychoanalysis of the Freudian sort was just emerging after the Second World War as an intellectual phenomenon. So he and my school teacher mother came together with my older brother to New Orleans, and growing up there, I knew that I was in a different place. All the children's storybooks would show streets looking a certain way, and our streets didn't really look quite that way, although they were very beautiful, with magnolia blossoms and tremendous humidity that would bring out the perfume of those flowers. In the
tremendous
way that,
humidity would be burdensome on occasion too.
The humidity would just bring out those blossoms, and it was really heady. The atmosphere of New Orleans is somewhat European. So we would go to neighborhood restaurants on a Thursday night, kind of mom's night out, and we would stroll around areas that were filled with gardens, always in bloom. And the result was that somehow I think I always wanted to learn about other cultures, other languages, and as it turns out, other legal systems.
Well, Louisiana actually does have all three of those that are other from most other places in the United States.
That's right. So I grew up going to summer camps in Tennessee and having a more conventional Southern experience. Otherwise, my parents were really not Southerners and were not in that mode. But I really did appreciate the art and architecture of New Orleans, and again, eventually, the fact that it has a civil law legal system. And that's been a bit corrupted or adulterated, one might say, over time, but the basic concepts, which I learned to some extent in law school, along with national law and regular American common law, those concepts have stuck with me and made it much easier to learn about these other jurisdictions.
I would think, since it's based on the civil law system, which is used in an awful lot of other places, that it would help.
Yes, exactly. It's the majority of the world.
Very much. It's interesting. So you grew up in a city that some of us remember for the good times when we would go there briefly for a meeting or something. And we're talking, actually, to put this in context, in February of 2000, and the AELL was meeting there this next summer, as I recall.
Yes, and I'm really looking forward to it because my parents have passed away. My father, right before the 2005 Katrina disaster, and there was one other AALL conference, I think rather shortly thereafter. Shortly meaning a couple of years, which meant there was not complete recovery. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the city again, and I believe it is pretty much back in order.
I would imagine they've had enough time, and a city like that, they'd want to rebuild most of it. And they've certainly done a lot of work on your things that keep the river and sea out. So hopefully they'll work fine if there's another storm of that sort. But they've done a lot to fix it up, I hear.
Well, all we have to fear now is climate change.
That is real.
That city is below sea level.
Yeah, I know. Well, even the other coastal cities, the reality is, from the projections from the science, the sea levels will rise, and we've always liked to live near the ocean or the water, and that may prove to be a problem. Well, that's interesting. So you were raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, and that sounds fascinating in its own right, but perhaps in addition to that, you have certain hobbies or passions that you indulge in now. Do you have any of those that you'd like to mention?
I do. I have actually always been very bookish, and of recent years I've become more and more interested in rare books and in historically rare materials. So materials from the Middle Ages, medieval manuscripts, from the Renaissance or early modern period. And I don't have the means to be a collector, but I have incorporated this interest into my approach to librarianship. And occasionally I look back and wonder if this was not yet another road not taken, in that I somehow have managed to raise two children who are interested in classical languages. We're talking about Latin and ancient Greek. So my daughter, who is now 33, is a professor of English and comparative literature at York University in the United Kingdom.
Okay.
She has been a Mellon Fellow of the Rare Book School, and she and I have both attended Rare Book School and share the, in my case, hobby, in her case, professional use of rare materials. So it's been both a hobby and kind of an inspiration. My son, who is currently at the University of Chicago and about to graduate, is also majoring in classics and English literature. So we don't know what he is going to be doing. And he is not as involved with rare materials, but he's quite interested in ancient languages. I have a lot to do with music. Again, both my children and myself are involved with music. I was typically one of the young people sent off to piano lessons as a child, and I had a physical condition that caused me to have to stop, a spinal injury condition.
Oh, that's too bad.
So that actually got completely resolved, but I wasn't able to pick up any work with music until college, and then off in different directions to graduate and law school. So I've recently started relearning the recorder, the instrument that, again, many elementary school children learn to play. But I'm interested in early music from the Renaissance and Baroque period.
You're playing it as if it was a period instrument?
One of those instruments, the soprano in particular, and some of the alto and tenor recorders, are still used in early music performances. And I am a long way away from being able to be part of a performance. But I do sing in a choir, which also has a strong orientation towards some early music pieces, and I'm enjoying those things very much, along with yoga and meditation. I engage in Buddhist meditation with
That's
a sangha.
supposed to be very good for you. It helps you relax.
Good.
And the yoga gives you just a little bit of exercise, but it's very helpful exercise, I'm told.
It's very good. It's very good for focus and concentration, and in general, it gradually changes you. Makes you all the time a bit more calmer, not just when you're anxious.
That's probably not a bad characteristic to develop, however you do it.
Not a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you have a full life on the side as well as here at work, and that's the way it probably is best. It's sort of beginning to focus more on you as a professional. I know that you have already mentioned college and law school, but you have 4 degrees. You want to tell us what they are and where you got each?
Yes, well, my BA is from Smith College, and so it might be more like 5 degrees. I spent a year and a half applying to universities in the UK, in the United Kingdom, but during that time, in addition to working, I got a master's degree at the University of Virginia in English literature. And then I went to St. Hugh's College, Oxford, for 2 years initially, and received the MLit degree because I had met a lot of people who were interested in law and legal philosophy, and I started to get worried even then about my concentration in English literature, even though it's absolutely my first love. And I wanted to be a college professor, this bookish young woman who was wandering around in the magnolia
and now
blossoms.
you have a daughter who is.
And now I have a daughter who is, although I did not pressure or engineer that in any way.
No,
it was
but
just
you
very
influenced
odd.
her by your own love. I'm sure that she's picked up on
I
it.
hope so. I
Yeah.
hope so. We certainly read a
And
lot
your
of
son,
Greek
too.
mythology and things like that. That's how I entertained them.
Yeah.
But at the time that I decided to go to law school, I guess I based it in a very quirky way on the experience that some of my fellow Americans had studying law at Oxford, which is an undergraduate degree there, as it is most places outside of the United States and Canada.
Yeah.
We're the only ones who do it as a graduate degree.
Yes.
So when I decided where to go to law school, I really was not sure I wanted to go back to New Orleans, but I was very attracted to Tulane's curriculum. The comparative law has always seemed to me to be sort of a department of legal philosophy, because your comparison of these systems kind of forces you to think about things maybe more in testing out, practically speaking, you know, what kinds of solutions to legal problems work best, and maybe there's more than one way to organize that thinking. So I went to Tulane and then briefly went back to the UK thinking about doing a doctorate and having both, and maybe trying to enter the legal professoriate. But I ended up having to really look carefully at my resources and what was going to be more practical, continuing to be a professional student or actually getting out there. So that's when I started to explore law librarianship, which I actually had not thought about at all while I was in law school.
So you did not have someone saying in your ear, law librarianship is what you should consider or anything like that. You just came to this kind of through your own process?
More or less. I came to New York City with my first husband, and he was working in a law firm, and I got a job as a law clerk and did a clerkship in federal court in New Jersey. So during that time, I was in a 2-year clerkship with the Honorable Serena Peretti, who at that time was a magistrate to district judges. So I got to work on all the cases of the district judges. And I knew that just as I had enjoyed the research in Victorian literature that I had done at Oxford, I knew that I still really liked research. And I wasn't entirely sure what to do about that, because I had law school friends during those 2 years who were not necessarily as happy as they thought they were going to be working in so-called big law, you know, the big Wall Street law firms. It was pretty
Those
exhausting.
are tough jobs. They're usually well compensated.
Very
but,
well compensated,
you
although
earn it.
exactly. So one of my Tulane colleagues said, well, you know, I work about 80 hours a week, and I did the math, and at that time the salaries were very high, but relatively speaking, so of course not number for number what they are now, but comparatively, I sort of did the math and divided it all up, and she said, actually, I said, it comes to a little above minimum wage when you do the
all the
hours.
hours and weekends and everything else. Yeah,
exactly. So I thought, but mainly it was because I had the feeling that that wasn't me. So I actually started a program of informational interviewing. I found out who the directors were of area libraries, and I literally did not know these people. So I audaciously did some cold calling and ended up having these informational interviews with several of the librarians of the area. So at that time, it was Joyce Saltalamacchia at New York Law School, a German fellow whose name I tried to pull up for this interview, and I can't quite recall, at Fordham. He was actually a professor asked to take over the library. Jim Hoover was at Columbia, where I later worked, and the closest to a mentor, I would say more of an inspiration, was Diana Vincent Davis, the late Diana Vincent Davis at NYU.
She was a mentor to a lot of people, from what I've been told.
She was just marvelous. Well, of course, I had been in my stint in my scholarly ambitions at Oxford, and she was educated at Cambridge, and we got along extremely well. She was still at NYU. So I actually had a conversation with my parents then, even though I was in my early 30s and about to get married a second time. I said, well, I'm going to have to get yet another degree. So to fill out the degrees, after the JD, of course, I got an MLS at Columbia. And the way I did that, because it was very expensive, was I humbled myself and got a job working in the main library as a serials adder, as it was called. So I took a staff union position with all my other many degrees, and it really worked out well because at that time it was 100% tuition and there was no taxation on it. The Reagan administration hadn't quite gotten around to that yet.
They got after the post-baccalaureate levels, as it turned out.
They did.
So, undergraduates stayed tax-free for a while.
Yes, that's correct. And so I get that benefit now with Georgetown, which is maintains some wonderful benefits here for that reason. But I went through and got the MLS, and that's, you know, the last degree that I received. And I really loved the Columbia campus. So one day I was sitting outside having lunch, and the Rare Book Librarian said, you know, there's a librarian over in the law school. You have a law degree, right? And I said, yes, I do. And she said, well, she's going to be going out on parental leave. And they're looking for someone to just fill in. And I said, well, you know, I still don't have my MLS yet. I'm a few credits away. She said, well, why don't you go talk to them? Well, sure enough, they were actually delighted to have someone in that status come on for 9 months. Well, there must have been something in the water of that building, because within that 9-month period, I became pregnant with my first child. So then I was home for 1 year, and amazingly, Scott Pagel, who's now here at GW, called me up after I'd been home for about a year, and he said, he was at Columbia, and said, the person who went on parental leave, she's actually left her job. She's going back to the Czech Republic. Well, it wasn't the Czech Republic quite yet, but they were anticipating.
Yeah, they were looking ahead.
This was the late 80s.
Yeah.
And prior to that, I had also received a call. I think it might also have been from Scott, so I don't know why he was looking out for my career, but I had been told about the lawyer librarian position at New York Law School. So I did do a 2-year stint at New York Law School, and then finally this permanent position opened up at Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
New York Law School was fantastic in that this, what some people refer to as being more of a basic education, especially for evening students, was a great experience for me.
Mm-hmm.
Adults are very curious people, and in fact there were police officers and all sorts of people in their student body, so it made for a different experience, and I was just doing main sort of Anglo-American work there. Well, when a foreign comparative and international job opened up at Columbia, I was ready because I had been working with the dean at New York Law School, and I knew that Columbia was going to have a very demanding faculty, which it did. And I went into that job. I was able to get childcare for my child, had finished my MLS in the meantime, and that was where I was for 10 years.
Wow. So you took advantage of child care. Was a fringe benefit in those days?
No, it was not a fringe benefit, so of course that was a great
Oh, but it was
challenge.
available.
I was able to arrange it.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's always troublesome, even today, juggling all the priorities in your life when you have young children.
It is, and I put under the category of other topics for this discussion some of my own reflections on that.
Well, do you want to bring those up now, or would you like to wait a little bit? Since we sort of triggered the topic.
I'll wait a bit, though, because
Okay.
I think that it might come more appropriately as I reach a point in my career when I'm assessing, really, that career looking back.
Well, one of the things we often have in our early careers, and sometimes not so early, are people we look to as mentors. Do you have any names that come to mind of people who sort of played that role one way or another in your life?
I do, in a way. I didn't have any formal mentoring, and I'm not sure that there was quite as much in those days, although I think that it really varied depending on with whom you were working. I have never really had a mentor at my place of work, but in some ways that's an advantage because it can be helpful to get other perspectives. I began representing Columbia at a group that formed in the early 1980s. I think Kent McKeever was a spearhead for this. And it became known as the Northeast Foreign Law Librarians Cooperative Group, and it still exists today. And I still participate in it today. I was brought to these meetings initially by Blanca Coudet, who was another member of what we sometimes teasingly call the Czech Mafia, or the Eastern European Mafia of foreign and international librarians, who were people, men and women, who had left Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe at some point in their careers and had come to the United States seeking a better life.
Yeah.
They were sort of refugees. In many cases, there wasn't one precipitating event. The Soviet Union, for example, had a lot of people they called refuseniks, who came to New York City and populated the Upper West Side and who were highly educated and really wonderful people. So Blanca very kindly introduced me around to all the other colleagues who were doing foreign and international law, and as a result of those meetings where we discussed the very early databases and print materials, what to buy, how to cope with finding materials in languages that you don't read, and that was my education and mentoring in the field. It really was a lot of fun and so interesting.
Yeah, there was an earlier wave of refugees from Nazi Germany or Europe, and who populated a lot of those same sorts of positions in our profession, sort of the next generation back from the ones you're describing, I think.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Pat, and some of them also became professors. So
Yes.
in Columbia, I don't know that he was specifically coming from Germany because of the Nazi regime, but he well could have been. But Arthur Schiller is an important figure in the classification of foreign law. Schiller invented a classification system that is still in use at Columbia, which was a marvelous retrieval tool. He was a scholar of both German but also Roman law, as many British and German law professors were and still are. He took the legal materials, the primary legal materials of those jurisdictions, and he classified them according to the type of publication it was, as well as its subject matter. So this would be tricky for the most formally trained of librarians, but it enabled someone who didn't read a language to be able to go into an online catalog once it was computerized and to find all the civil codes, for example, that Columbia owned, going back to the very earliest one, perhaps a published book, not a rare book, but still one that might have been published in the early 19th century after the code was first formulated by Napoleon. And you would just put in FR for France, so every country had an abbreviation, and you would put in 121, so the 100 level coded all the civil codes and statutes, and then there were 200, 300, and 400 levels that got into topical areas. So people would often ask me, how do you find materials in Chinese and Russian? And I said, well, thanks to the Schiller classification system, if someone says, what's your most recent code for Russia, which actually has a kind of a meta code, a code that's called Principles of Civil Legislation. So it wasn't the code in the Napoleonic tradition, it was a little bit different. Put in Rus S, as it was then when it was Soviet, 121, and you pulled them all up. So it was quirky, but a great time in my career.
Sounds like a wonderful tool to learn about, too.
It was a great tool, and as a result, the students there who were interested in the scholarship of comparative law had and still have an enormous advantage.
Well, you had an interesting classification in the period when I was at Yale that actually they may still use. And it used a name for country for foreign jurisdiction, and one of the names was Abyssinia, which of course became Ethiopia long before I was there. And we had a faculty member, not a library person, but a faculty member who was just adamant that we could not have that on our shelves. It was just obsolete. And of course, all these books, everything would have to be changed in the old days before computers, and it couldn't be done. My boss, the library director, fended him off, but I think he had a hell of a time doing it.
Well, the historic materials that Columbia had, I believe that they were already classified, many of them, in such a way that the colonial period itself was recognized by Professor Schiller. So he had kind of anticipated some of this.
Mira Pemsler is another name that comes to mind. She was at Yale, and then she went to Columbia in cataloging, and there may have been some commonality that went with her.
Right.
Maybe we should send that professor down there and see what things were.
That could be. That would have been before my time, but I was very lucky to be a recipient of the legacy of these librarians and scholars who had worked in these areas. Well,
it looks like that you spent a little bit of time up at the Bora Laskin Law Library in Toronto in between none of these. Do you want to mention that and a little about what you did there?
Yes. When my second child was born, it seemed pretty clear that staying in Manhattan as much as we really loved it.
Uh-huh.
Was going to be hard to do. But that wasn't my only motivation. I really wanted to go to a smaller library and to see what it would be like to work in a library outside the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I had a vague notion and had discussed with my husband the idea of perhaps a European library. Then an ad popped up, just came into my email
Mm-hmm.
for someone to do foreign and international law at the Boralaska Law Library, which they had not had before.
Uh-huh.
So I applied. I said, oh, I'll just see if they're interested in interviewing me. So they definitely were. And I went up there, and my daughter was between junior high school and high school.
Mm-hmm.
So when they offered me the job, I was able to move her, and my son was able to start a kindergarten program, and in his case, French immersion. So it worked out really well for my family and for me, and so for 4 years we were there.
Mm-hmm.
The only downside of it was that it was impossible for my husband to find employment.
Oh.
So,
Did he have a legal authorization to work, or so it was
Yes.
a job problem, or did he have trouble there?
So at that time, I had, of course, no problem because the university had immigration lawyers who pre-screened
Yeah.
anyone who came into Canada for a Canadian job. They used the process similar to one here, whereby they demonstrated that no one in Canada could fill that exact position, and that was somewhat true. Everyone at the federal level is bilingual, but of
Mhm.
course that doesn't necessarily mean they have legal training or that they really know anything about
Yeah.
foreign or international legal materials.
So they got you a special visa that
So that
come in as
enabled
an expert.
That enabled us to enter, and actually librarians were under the old NAFTA. They were
Oh,
specifically named in the treaty, so that was another plus
okay.
to enable information professionals to move back and forth. My husband, however, had been an administrator, so he had worked for the New York City Board of Education,
All right.
and his skills were more generic, but possibly not fitting in as well with Canada's more restrictive labor market. So that was a bit of a missed opportunity. We ended up deciding that we probably would need to come back to the United States, and so that's when the Georgetown job
Yes,
came up. So that's how
yeah.
I ended up back here with the prospect of at least doing something a little bit different with foreign and international law, and that was taking over the establishment in another building, which is 2 buildings over from where we are now,
Mhm.
called the John Wolfe International and Comparative Law Library. And John Wolfe was yet another one of those German professors who had come here in the wake of the disturbances in the 1930s and during the wartime period,
Mhm.
and became a law professor in his retirement. So he started
In
his
his
career
retirement,
here
that's interesting.
at age 65 and went on to serve as the oldest living law professor upon his death at 99,
Wow.
who was still teaching.
Still teaching. Wow.
So he passed away, I think, right before he had already written his final exam for the students, but he had a fall or something, and
Oh,
that
that's
gave
too
him an
bad.
injury, and he called, rumor has it, or the story has it, that he called up the dean here and said, "Dean, I'm so sorry, I've written my exam, but I may not be able to administer it." So that was, at the age of 99, his last class that he taught, and he passed away, I think, about a month later in January of whatever year that was. It would have been maybe about 2005 or 6.
I hesitate to ask, but I'm intrigued. Did he actually was able to give the exam, or at least grade it?
Well, the exam was distributed, yes.
Yeah.
He finished his teaching, and I am not sure who graded the exams, but he
No.
did have, I think, Professor Franz Vero, who still is affiliated, I think, or is off and on affiliated with Georgetown from Switzerland. He joined Professor Wolfe on many occasions, and they shared an interest in music, and so I imagine that someone else was called in to grade the papers.
It's got to be difficult to grade somebody else's exam.
Oh, absolutely. He had been one of those secretly richer than people thought, quiet kinds of individuals, and so the library was named for him because of his donation of funds.
Yeah, I remember when that opened up. Bob Oakley was your
Bob
head
was still
librarian.
here and still with us, and we had a dedication of that entire building. The Hotang International Law Building was dedicated at the same time.
We were all jealous of Bob with this library that you have here, the Williams Library, and how large it was compared to those of some of the rest of us. And then he got another building and another library over there. It was exciting.
It was, and I really did not get to know this building. It's so large. Until 2 years ago when they closed the Wolfe Library and I was obliged to come over here and take another position. So I'm still sort of learning this building, but I must say that my recommendation for library architecture, especially now that space is in some cases not needed as much, particularly if there's a good off-site storage solution.
Yeah. Or even the digitalization of much of some of the basic stuff.
Exactly.
Those took up a lot of space, especially in a library like Georgetown years ago, so the student body size.
Right, with digitization.
Yeah.
So that being the case, actually I think it opens up the possibility of law libraries going back to being a part of a main building. So this library originally, long before my time, was in the McDonough building next door.
That's right.
And
there was a grand stairway.
Yes,
up
there still is.
And we all looked at that and said, that's an interesting waste of space. We didn't
Right.
say this directly to any architects, but
no, exactly.
yeah.
So my experience then in running the Wolfe Library was that we went back to this model just for that smaller collection. We went back to the model of having a library inside a building. And what is the big advantage of that? Well, the big advantage is that we librarians are riding the elevators with the professors and the students.
And we can recognize each other as part of the same team.
Those elevator conversations, as they say, but it was a great way to remain visible and to be made visible. Everyone was aware that the library was right in the center of the building.
Yeah. Well, that one was, and it was in the upper section as you came in, and there was this internal stairway, and you just went up to it, and the library was basically all around that atrium, I guess is what it was.
Yes. Now later on, speaking of stairwells that take up space, that stairwell was removed.
Oh, was it?
It was.
No. They had one at another law school here in town, George Washington, and one version of their building, everybody came in down below and took the elevator up, but they had a sort of a stairway up the outside of the building, though it was covered. And it was supposed to be an entree to the library, but it turned out that everybody who had to walk it preferred the elevator entree.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting. Well, you have done a lot of things here at Georgetown. Do you want to elaborate any more on any parts of it, or at this point, or should we move on to some of the outside service and so on you've done to the associations and the profession itself?
Well, we can start, I think, with the Wolfe Library, because I think it's somewhat of an untold story.
All right.
That we were able to create a service point that circulated materials and also provided very accessible and very attractive open stacks for the print books. And in addition to that, we had a very nice international computer learning center. So we had what was originally all Mac, and then I think they fixed it so that you could switch terminals for students between the Windows operating system and Mac. It was a very attractive space for presentations. The only downside there was that it only would seat about 12 to 15 people. So it wasn't very large, and we had group study rooms that were capable of being Apple TV rooms and so on, which now here in Williams, many of the study rooms have been retrofitted to do the same thing. But when we first opened, it was a delightful open space, and we provided all of the services to students either there or in the classroom buildings of McDonough. So my team, just as all the reference librarians here are doing now, and we still have our international librarians. Here at Georgetown, we do a lot of work for faculty, writing memoranda, doing projects, going into classes to speak, teaching as adjuncts in 4-credit classes with, of course, the approval of the faculty. They have to approve an application that we make.
Yeah.
And so I think that it was part of the enhancement of the law students' experience that they had 2 fully active places to study. And I think during that time, I know I really learned a lot. And I remember thinking, oh, you know, I wish maybe this opportunity, the Wolfe Library opportunity, had come up about 10 years ago. And that would have really, I think, given me a boost, because I left that position having operated a service desk. And really that was something fairly new for me. And most foreign and international librarians don't get to have the experience, in many cases, of any supervision. Often a library doesn't have enough librarians or staff that someone in a reference capacity has anyone to supervise, except occasionally student workers or helpers perhaps, or research assistants or something like that. So that was a great opportunity. And we were able to forge close relationships with that faculty, with the Master of Law students.
Were they in
and
the same
doctoral
physical building as the library then in those days, those faculty?
They were intended to be, but actually the answer overall is no.
Oh.
But part of the reason was that, first of all, we have a really large faculty.
Oh, yes.
So there would not have been quite enough offices for everyone who did international work. Those who already had offices in the McDonough building were not eager to move. So younger faculty were there, visiting faculty. Our tax program for international tax was over in that building. And an assortment of our faculty members who, again, had international interests chose to be there. But it was an easy matter for us to just walk over into the McDonough building and meet with those faculty. We started a liaison program for the library generally. So when I say we, I don't mean the international people. We were sort of the natural liaisons of the international faculty, but subsequent to that, a formal program was begun. So now we have our reference staff, some of whom work technically in other departments, not just the reference department, but international and the library research services. We all get assigned full-time faculty members to serve, each of us on our own, and meet their needs or channel their needs to wherever the need should go.
Now, the present physical arrangement, you're here in the Edward Bennett Williams Library, which is a separate building from the rest of the campus buildings.
Yes.
Do you have any faculty members who have offices in this building other than the library faculty?
Right now, there are some centers and institutes that have offices here. So those centers and institutes are in some cases directed in a hands-on way by faculty, but in many other cases, an administrator, an executive director type of position is in that place. And of course, many of those executive directors are adjunct faculty, so it's kind of a mix in that way. But I think this building, while grand, I think it does illustrate some of the drawbacks of having your library in a separate building, because we don't interact on a day-to-day basis with faculty unless we affirmatively attend events or go to their offices.
And faculty have, other things on their minds and priorities on their time, so they often use their student assistants to come to the library and get stuff for them.
Right, exactly.
sometimes with orders not to sign it out because I don't want to be bothered by somebody wanting it back. But you didn't hear that from me.
No, of course not.
Maybe now in the days of digital, some of that problem has gone away with the students at least, but it's real.
Here it's very hard to get anything out because our detection system, I must say, is the best here of any library I've worked in. So that alarm goes off, and so we would always then make some inquiries about the status of the person and the materials that were being carried out.
Yeah. So you now have been here for
16 years.
16 years and going strong. That sounds wonderful. One of the benefits of private higher ed is tuition benefits for families and family members and your two children who are now no longer really children.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on that dealing with the situations when women are childbearing age, I think I'm sort of using my own phrasing, and you had wanted to comment on that, and I want to sort of bring us back to that at this point if we can.
Oh, sure. I can talk a little bit about that and also cover a bit about, you had also asked me about my outside activities.
Yeah, we can get to that as well.
LALL and all those.
I'm sort of slipping this in ahead of that.
I see, okay. Yeah. So the challenge, I think, that in many ways librarians face as much as any other profession, and when I described this to relatives, they were saying, well, but librarianship used to be sort of a woman's profession, and I said, well, not entirely. And of course not law librarianship so much originally, because there just simply weren't that many women who attended law school, and
that's right.
In some cases many law libraries did not feel that they needed someone with a legal qualification until legal information in this country became more and more complex. And litigation became so complicated that West Publishing Company had to invent and refine systems for retrieving information even before there was the internet or any electronic information. We had our whole key number and digest system, which I and people of our generation, grew up with and had to learn to master initially.
But it also kind of helped empower some of the places to have people in the library who may not have had the kind of sophisticated library experience and training that we get today and take for granted.
Exactly. The challenge now is twofold. I don't have empirical data, so I think that's maybe one of the reasons I'm a little reluctant to do anything other than just opine and also maybe plan for some future research. I'd like to find out, preferably with a director as a co-author, I'd love to explore higher positions in libraries and how many of them have been held by people who have family obligations, either caretaking of elderly people or children. So I mean, caregiving is caregiving. It doesn't have to be of children.
Yeah.
Because my general impression, my unscientific impression, is that there aren't so many, and it's not easy to do because with directorships being now often tied in with faculty status, which is of course a very good thing, and in some cases deanships, it can end up being two jobs in one.
Yeah.
I know that after I had done this informational interviewing that kind of had gotten me launched in my career, my encounters down the line were with people who often said, well, I am the law librarian from Monday through Friday, and then I spend Saturday and Sunday preparing my doctrinal or other classes if they were full faculty members and had to teach. So pretty much it's a 7-day-a-week job. So I think that not only in librarianship, but I think in law practice, this is a recognized problem.
Yeah.
I read all the National Law Journal alerts that come across in my email, and I'm thinking, you know, I'm sitting here in 2020, and there's been tremendous progress and improvement, and yet some of the same issues keep coming up. It's why women aren't making partner. You know, this particular big law firm just got finished settling a suit over gender bias and discrimination in the so-called mommy track and all that. And I said to myself, I said, wow, you know, we are still having this conversation and we're still struggling with this. So I think what we really do need is not someone like me sort of guessing like, well, gee, it seems like this is really hard to do, or I know I would have struggled even more if I had to try to do this, is get some, you know, some data, some empirical evidence, and maybe send out surveys. But it's a touchy subject, so I'm always thinking I'll have to wait until after I retire, and then I could try to explore it, because if I ended up writing some sort of controversial report, I said maybe it's better if I'm not still active in the profession.
Well, you know, the number of women going into law today, sometimes with some problems when they get out of law school, is greatly increased from, you know, 40, 45 years ago.
Well, it's really been a sea change.
Some of this is the, you know, how you respond, or should you respond, and so how to the fact that you don't have the cookie cutter guys as lawyers, and now you have a variety of men and women, and the roles of the genders within marriage have also evolved, so that now there's more participation often in marriages by both spouses in the rearing and care of the children. And you know, we are experimenting with parental leave, but that's only a few weeks after a child is born generally. And then there's family medical leave, but again, that tends to be, if it's available, it's limited to, you know, a certain amount of time, and then it's gone. And you're right, there's some very interesting issues that you could be looking into, I think.
Well, and it again comes back to the global context. So when you look at these issues comparatively, as is frequently mentioned during, you know, this current presidential campaign and so forth, we look at countries around the world, and most industrialized countries have more opportunities for people to create a work-life balance.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
Everything is a trade-off, but it may be that as we enter a new phase in technology and industrialization, that it's time to take a second look in a very global way. So people always mention the Scandinavian countries, and many people don't know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, was a Columbia professor. That's part of her biography. So people who've seen the movie, you know, RBG and all of that would know this. But she was very interested in Scandinavian family law when she was there. So I recall seeing her name cropping up in our system, and there were drafts in some of her papers of articles and things that she worked on in the area of family law, using Scandinavian countries even then as a model.
Well, they were sort of on the edge ahead of us, I guess. So that would be the appropriate place to look for a model if you wanted to question your own, I would think.
And Columbia had those materials, so it all kind of comes back to the library. You could actually, if you could read Swedish, you could do the research. Everyone in Sweden, I think, mostly who's educated, speaks English, but they actually, as I had to explain to many patrons, they do not publish their laws in English. They are in Swedish.
Well, you know, it's interesting in traveling in Europe, any of us who've done it, you find people that can speak English all over. Not everybody necessarily, but I've been astounded by the, you know, the amount of English-speaking people who are from that place that I'm visiting, who can deal with us in the right sense, because they can speak our language, and we as Americans are at a deficit, and usually we can't speak theirs.
Well, poor language training, I think, was part of the reason that, going back to the Eastern European and other people who've come into FCIL librarianship, is the command of languages, which many Americans don't have.
Yes. It was never really an emphasis, I guess, in our society. For lack of a better explanation, it would seem to be what might have been, whereas over in places like in Europe, where everyone's kind of closer together and more interactive now,
Right.
becomes important. Well, I was interrupted your train of thought and that I threw us into this tangent, but we were going to talk about your professional service and some of that. Would you like to do that now?
Sure. I really enjoyed my very first meetings with AALL because that was the first time outside of New York City that I got to meet with other international and foreign law librarians. Mm-hmm. And I think networking is always something that's been at the center of AALL. Yeah. But I think for FCIL librarians it was a bit more profound because we really were able to form a sort of subgroup, a kind of college of mutual instruction, and it made it really very beneficial to attend the meeting. And I certainly wouldn't say that the meetings of the other groups were not substantive, but we really tried in the FCIL to have meetings that covered substantive knowledge of other legal systems, as long as they also covered the bibliography and the primary and secondary sources of law that were germane to those jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. So it was great fun to go to the special interest section, and then the special interest section itself was and still is broken down into different smaller, I think at one time they were called working groups and now sort of interest groups that were jurisdictionally based. So I think when you and I were talking about this interview, you had mentioned about Russia and Soviet law, and there was some of that.
You had done some work early on in that.
And Eastern
I picked up on that from some of what I saw. Yeah.
Well, at Columbia, John Hazard, a professor who had been in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, so we're talking about, John Reed, and I don't know if you've seen the film Reds, talking about the fascination that some American intellectuals had with the early Soviet period after some of the violence calmed down, or even when some of the violence was still going on in the 20s and 30s, and trying to sort of look at this experimental society. And he brought back just an enormous amount of materials, so it formed a core collection of Soviet materials. And then we had professors, again, from Czechoslovakia, or what's now the Czech Republic, such as Radislav Pihota and others, who were also part of the development of arbitration. Columbia had people like Oscar Schachter and others who were part of the early United Nations organizations. And so one of the things that was a lot of fun was to go to AALL and share. I had knowledge from that collection to share, and then Harvard, of course, was collecting everything, and they had all kinds of information and knowledge to share. So between AALL and this Northeast Foreign Law Librarians group that I described earlier, there was continuing legal librarian education going on all the time, and that made it really very stimulating and fun. I would always come away, I would save all of my materials and notes and the handouts in those days, which were migrating toward or being created on the internet, but we still clutched our papers from AALL, and we would refer to them. It became a great way to do collection development, to check up on our collections and find out if we had all the materials that were necessary. And it was much more of a challenge to collect for jurisdictions of the world, not necessarily because of language, but just because of the sheer quantity of material. The U.S. is a very litigious place, but cases are cases, and pretty much people know what the reporters are and where they're going to appear. But the fun, in my view, and the challenge of FCIL is to kind of remember where are the cases reported in all these different other jurisdictions. Some places include them in an official gazette, which is just like a daily newspaper kind of format.
Almost a throwaway.
Almost a throwaway.
Yeah, looks it because they're usually on paper.
On newsprint.
Yeah.
And the civil codes, of course, are the core private laws that when Americans hear the word code, they think of a multi-volume set like the United States Code sitting on a shelf and are amazed to find that, the French Civil Code is just one book. It's one volume subdivided into the different subtopics of private law of citizens with each other instead of citizens with the state. So all of that has been a lot of fun to keep up with. And it is also a little bit more interdisciplinary. I think that was another thing that made AALL fun, is that we started some rather far out groups. I mean, far out in the sense of, I've been chair for a while of something called the Roman Law Interest Group, and people might say, who cares? But the librarian at Berkeley, who retired not too long ago, Lucia Diamond, and others, especially some of the UK librarians, would come together and talk about how it's a basis for learning all civil law jurisdictions. If you learn how the Roman law topics were subdivided, that gives you a template for more easily learning and incorporating what goes on in all these other modern jurisdictions.
So I think that's derivatives ultimately of the Roman law system.
Ultimately, though, the emergence of nation states really changed all of that. So a lot of my presentations and publishing was all about the civil law tradition, I guess one would say. So that's been an area of interest. And I've put on and moderated several panels over the years. Roberta Schaefer and I did one of the early sort of trainings of the next generation. I think that's how the series was billed. And every year for 5 years at AALL, we would do a pre-conference workshop on the law of the European Union, or in the case of the one that Roberta and I did, it was about transnational law conceived of as all those subtopics when private law becomes, in effect, more like public international law through treaties of harmonization. So, for example, criminal law, we think of it as extremely local, but we've progressed the harmonization of some of that and the intervention of international norms into now we have an international criminal court, which is controversial, but still it's something that evolved, and there's international copyright and international environmental law and so on. So all these kinds of developments. Many people don't realize there's been, for decades, a tribunal of the law of the sea. It's one of those international tribunals that no one thinks of, or rarely they do, because everyone's heard of the International Court of Justice, and many people...
Or even some of the international courts of human rights, like the Inter-American one.
The Inter-American system, and I mean the European system of human rights is a very viable system that is not at all... it's not at all a fantasy or an idea of creating norms. It actually hands down binding decisions to the states that are part of the Council of Europe.
Some of those international tribunals have some real clout, and some, should we say, former thugs running governments have found out after they lose power there.
Right, to some extent. I mean, it's
not flawless, and it's not everybody,
flawless,
but there are a few that have gotten hauled before them and successfully prosecuted.
So I guess this is all my way of saying that occasionally people ask, what about coming up with topics? Over the years people have said topics to write about, or for Law Library Journal, or for this and that. I said, well, there's just a wealth of topics in international law.
So that's never been a problem for you.
That has never been a problem.
That's good.
And when I got into kind of the rare book angle of things, I got very interested in even the physical qualities of some of the, and the properties of some of the early codes of both Roman law and of religious law, such as canon law, that are formatted in a particular way with text and commentary, and I got fascinated by that for a while. And even marginalia is interesting to me, and old copybooks of law students. So there's just so much out there that can be explored, and that I think can help us understand perhaps a little bit the nature of the internet or the World Wide Web, only because people have always been trying to get visually simultaneous views of texts and guiding interpretations. And in the print era, they did it by literally surrounding a bit of core primary text with all the commentaries. So whether it's religious Talmudic law in the Jewish tradition or canon law, they set up these pages, and to me it resonated as being somewhat similar to the hypertextualism of our World Wide Web. I will never forget signing up to take the first course in the internet when it was Gopher, and was just a black screen with either orange or green writing on it where you would type in some commands. And I signed up and volunteered to attend that course at Columbia's main library and then come and tell my law colleagues about it. So for 1 nanosecond, I was actually ahead of the curve in technology. And then since then, I think the other challenge in librarianship is that the core skills that everyone needs to have should be really emphasized and also publicized, so that people who enter the profession now should try to really make sure that they
Even
have
the library school
depth.
curriculums need to be looked at a little more carefully and
Yeah,
modernized here
yes,
too.
I think they have changed a great deal, and some of them have become almost completely technological. So there's been a lot of convergence with information science, but I think it could go even further, and would not, in my opinion, mean that you're abandoning print or you're abandoning these other modes of communication, because we have a digitization project going on here that I'm sure Michelle Wu will talk about in her interview, that aims to disseminate the same information in more formats. And then when you look at these rare book collections, one of the ways I was able to write one of my publications about rare legal materials was because I could go to the Columbia Digital Scriptorium and I could find those images without having to get on a train and go to Columbia and put on white gloves and go into a room. I was able to see, yes, I was able to see some of those images and even capture them without having to undertake all the fuss and bother.
I see some of the results of some of that work that I've come across, and it's just absolutely, it's a game changer.
It's really wonderful.
That, and I remember going to the Beinecke Library at Yale one time. I had a footnote to run down, and they had to bring me the book, and I had to wear the gloves. I mean, it was very formalistic, but necessary for given what we were dealing with.
Yes, no, exactly.
And now some of that you can just call from your desk.
And it's less wear and tear on those materials if people are able to view them.
Yeah.
One has to be cautious, of course, that empirically, if you're looking for stains or if you're looking for variations in either typescript or in manuscript, those may not show up as well even with the best of our current digital reproduction, but it's pretty darn good, and it's really a lot of fun to be able to work with it.
Presumably, all this technology will become better and better and better as it moves along, and some of those deficits will no longer be a problem.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's definitely true and very important. Another outside activity that I really enjoyed during my career was, while I was in Canada, I was able to remain within my old network of the Northeast group of people. And when Kathleen Price was the director at NYU, this was after she was the law librarian of Congress, she was able to get some money from the Star Foundation, which was, again, an insurance-related conglomerate, and was able to bring together a group of universities, of which Toronto was one, so I got to sort of wear a Canadian hat. And we went on a trip prior to the International Association of Law Libraries meeting, which was in Cape Town, South Africa. And we went there and did about 10 days of training for African librarians from English-speaking jurisdictions. We did have someone who was from the nascent Rwanda Tribunal, so this would have been in the early aughts, you know, from between 2000 and 2004, who happened to be French-speaking because the language of that tribunal was French. And we really got to know these librarians and learned all about their challenges, and it made us sort of feel as though, well, if your challenge in librarianship is wondering if the electrical generator is going to come on every day in your library, and that's kind of a far cry from saying, oh, well, I wonder if we'll be able to afford this particular serial or book. It's, you know, having the lights come on is even a little more basic than that. So that was very rewarding, and we also learned a lot from them, so there was a big mutual exchange of information. And I'm very proud of our group here at Georgetown. Mabel Shaw and Heather Casey and Charles Bjork are our international librarians now. I mean, in the sense that, sadly for me, but wonderful for them, I've turned a lot of it over to them. They all, and Heather Casey in particular, because she's fluent in French, she has been able to work with IFLA and participate in a lot of training for librarians around the world. And I think it's really important. We need to share the wealth of all the materials we've been able to accumulate in the United States.
Well, you're in a good place to do it. You're in a good city, and you know, the outreach that's possible, it should be able to be something you can pull off.
Well, I would really only add that I think in the future of libraries, it may be that librarians will have some choices in how they want to work and in which contexts. And I think it's because of this convergence we were just speaking about. There's a convergence and maybe also a little bit of a divergence that technology is going to drive how information is provided. And that's going to be actually a plus. It's going to be really good. The research part of that, so the kind of reference librarian and the substantive knowledge piece of that, in some ways I could see that moving out of the library per se, the library as a building or possibly even as an organizational structure, and moving into the law school in some capacity. I know that we've had such an amazing group of people working here in our Library Research Services department, and I'm now very pleased to be supervising those three departments, the International, the Library Research Services, and Reference. They're all doing fabulous work for faculty, and so in a way it could be that that aspect of librarianship is evolving toward kind of the Congressional Research Service model, kind of like CRS report writing model. And the technical parts of it would be managing the electronic information, which is now bundled together in such complex ways that you need massive spreadsheets to kind of make sure you know all the electronic titles and journals that you have, and also the ability to create metadata for digitized materials that might be unique. So it's a divergence, but it comes together towards the betterment of information for the legal profession and hopefully also for ordinary people to be able to do more research in the law.
Well, maybe on that note, that's interesting. I've enjoyed talking with you this afternoon and learning some of this background, which, you know, I really didn't know very much about. And it's an area in our field that's really moving, I think, and there's a need to further develop. I mean, the whole globalization of everything. It's bringing together all these diverse systems, and we have to accommodate to that reality in our own work.
Exactly. Well, I've enjoyed this very much, Pat, and hopefully we can carry the vanguard of globalization or global knowledge and not retreat from it. That's what we hope won't happen.
Well, we see in the political arena that currently in this country sort of a withdrawal, but that won't probably last forever, I hope.
I hope not.
Yeah. Well, with that, I want to thank you, Marylin J Raisch, for taking your time today to come and talk with me and contribute to our oral history. And I'm thanking you, of course, not only on my own behalf, but on behalf of Frank Hodek, your boss at the moment, Michelle Wu, is director here, and Dick Spinelli. They're the colleagues with whom I've had the opportunity to work for a number of years now to put together this oral history of our profession, law librarianship, for the Hein database called Hein Online. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.